I got a bunch of questions here, all of which are from neurotypical wives about their husband with autism spectrum disorder. And these are questions specifically from the NT ladies in my counseling groups. And I thought I would just address them all in one cluster here instead of doing them individually. And so we'll run through here real quick. The first one, she asked, does autism spectrum disorder, does the diagnosis of that change anything? Well, the actual diagnosis doesn't change anything, no. It doesn't change who your husband is or what he can accomplish. It does give him somewhat of a roadmap to the traits that he's likely to experience and some of the treatment strategies to address those traits. But the diagnosis in and of itself doesn't change anything as long as the two of you know that you have communication breakdown and it causes a problem for both of you and you both want to fix it. Then we don't necessarily need to label that anything other than communication difficulties. And the next question is, does ASD level 1 get worse with age? And the answer to that is not likely. Most teens and adults with autism spectrum disorder have less severe symptoms and behaviors as they get older. And that's not to say that all adults on the spectrum get better, but the vast majority of them will. Some of them do get worse with age, but that is almost always the case with the individual who has just excessive amounts of anxiety and depression and then engages in so much destructive behavior to reduce his anxiety that his symptoms do get worse over time. The next one, can you be slightly autistic? Yeah, there's a spectrum, as you know. There's high functioning, moderate functioning, and low functioning, but even on the high end of the spectrum, which we call high functioning autism, right, there's another smaller spectrum. So that would be like high functioning, high moderate functioning, high low functioning. So there are some people that are so high on the high functioning end of the spectrum that they literally pass under the radar, and as far as everybody else is concerned, they're neurotypical. And the next question is, what are some of the red flags that I need to be aware of that may indicate my husband has autism spectrum disorder, as my suspicions lead me in the direction to believe that he does. Basically, if he has difficulty interpreting what you think and feel, if he has trouble interpreting your facial expressions, body language, and any other social cues that you give off, and if he has difficulty regulating his emotions, in other words, you witness shutdowns and or meltdowns, or we could also maybe call them adult temper tantrums, low frustration tolerance, these things would definitely indicate that a diagnosis, if he wants to seek a diagnosis, might be appropriate. What triggers my husband with Asperger's syndrome meltdowns? What triggers his meltdowns? Usually that has to do with sensory sensitivities, changes in routine, anxiety, communication difficulties that result in anxiety as well. So remember that people on the autism spectrum have this thing called mind blindness, which means they have a lot of unpredictability in their world, and so they try to make it as predictable as possible, and that comes through the use of a lot of routine and structure, and they don't like change as a result. And so when any changes to his routine come along, that is a trigger for a meltdown. But really, the changes in routine is just one form of anxiety-producing events. So the big picture here is anxiety is the main trigger for meltdowns, and there's different components that could be subsumed under anxiety. Those would be like sensory sensitivities, changes in routine, communication difficulties, and so on. Can a person with Asperger's feel love? Well, I would hope that we wouldn't even have to answer that question. Your husband with, in this case, Asperger's, he's not an automaton or a hologram or a robot, although I have some NT wives that say her husband does come off like Spock from Star Trek. But Of course, they feel love. They don't necessarily display their emotions much. So he would have empathy, but he may not have displayed empathy. And what I mean by that is he may not behave in certain ways or say certain things that convey empathy to the level that you would want. But he certainly can feel love and can certainly express empathy. In fact, in some cases, believe it or not, the ASD individual is so empathic that he has found from a very early age that it's just too painful to feel that empathy. He feels too closely the pain of others, and that is so anxiety-provoking that he literally shuts his feelings off. And so there it does appear that he's not a very loving, caring, sensitive, empathic person. And the next NT wife asks, what are the main symptoms to look for? Well, I touched on that earlier, but some of the main signs would be if you're, in this case, husband, I assume, finds it hard to understand what you're thinking or feeling, if he tends to get very anxious about social situations, if he finds it hard to make friends and prefers to be by himself over there somewhere engaged in his special interest away from family, if he often seems blunt, rude, or not interested in others without meaning to, that would be a main sign. And if he finds it hard to say how he feels and finds it hard to comprehend how you feel, those I think would be the main signs of autism spectrum disorder. Next, does ASD cause anxiety? Absolutely, 100%. I don't know anybody, and I've been working in this field for a while, who has Asperger's or high-functioning autism that does not have anxiety. There's varying degrees. Some have really high anxiety, some have moderate. But if they have super low anxiety and they've been diagnosed with ASD, they've probably been misdiagnosed. And the last question I'll entertain today is, do the symptoms of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism ever go away? Sometimes it's possible that the traits outlive their lifetime, and so to speak. So some of the traits that the individual may have exhibited as a teenager, for example, he's no longer exhibiting those. So research does, in the past several years, has shown that children can outgrow a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. In other words, their symptomology has lessened or decreased so dramatically as they've grown into the teenage years and young adult years that if they were to go back and get retested, they actually would just fall right out, just outside of the zone of being on the autism spectrum. So, and a lot of that has to do with early intervention, making sure that the child is taught social skills and gets all the other interventions that are needed at a very young age. I'm just kind of paraphrasing what some of the questions are like. They're wanting to know why they cannot get their husband with autism spectrum disorder to get it, quote unquote. That being, it's hard for them to convey to him how important it is to be emotionally reciprocal, to spend time with them, to make her feel important, and so on. And so they've pleaded and argued and complained and tried to be nice and tried to be tougher and all these different things, and they still say, I can't get him to get it. But just remember that you're probably employing a traditional approach that would work with the neurotypical brain. If you were trying to plead with somebody else, let's say a neurotypical coworker, and you use the method that you're using with your ASD husband, the NT coworker would probably get it and would want to cooperate with you. But the method that most NTs use to try to get their ASD husband to connect, it actually makes a bad problem worse in many cases, because it downloads in his mind as she's being parental and punitive. And this often raises his anxiety level, which in turn exacerbates the very symptoms of the disorder that you're annoyed with, namely low on empathy. So the paradox is due to some of the traits of the disorder, specifically executive function, theory of mind deficits, and weak central coherence. We'll take a brief look at each of those. And this is basically, these are the three main traits that get in the way of the NT trying to establish a connection with her husband with Asperger's or high-functioning autism. So the first thing is executive function. Now, this can be defined as a way in which people monitor and control their thoughts and actions. It's actually a broad category that includes processes such as working memory, planning, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control. Inhibitory control is one aspect of executive function, and it's the ability to restrain or inhibit potentially interfering responses and to self-regulate in certain situations. And if your husband can't self-regulate during difficult conversations with you, what that looks like is he either shuts down or melts down. And the second thing that gets in the way of her trying to establish a connection is theory of mind deficits. Theory of mind is the ability that we all have in order to make sense of the world we live in. You know, every person's thoughts, knowledge, beliefs, and desires make up his or her own unique theory of mind. From the ages around 4 years or so, typical kids, those without autism, understand that other people have their own thoughts. They have their own knowledge base, beliefs, and desires that will influence their behavior. However, people on the autism spectrum appear to have some difficulties conceptualizing the thoughts and feelings of others, and that downloads as lack of empathy in the neurotypical wife's mind. Since he has difficulty conceptualizing and appreciating her thoughts and feelings, she therefore makes the leap of logic that he evidently doesn't care, and he's selfish, narcissistic, and so on. So it is this mind blindness that may impair people on the autism spectrum to be able to relate to and understand the behavior of others. Mind blindness also means that, in this case, the ASD husband has difficulty in distinguishing whether someone's actions are intentional or accidental. So by failing to account for others' perspectives, people on the autism spectrum tend to misinterpret their messages. And many of the social skills deficits observed in people on the autism spectrum have their genesis in the lack of ability to decipher subtle meaning from the environment. For example, facial cues, body language, tone of voice, wordage, and so on. And then the third and last trait that gets in the way of the NT wife making a true connection as she would like is central coherence, and this is the ability to focus on both details as well as the big picture. So people with autism spectrum disorder appear to have a heightened focus on details rather than the big picture. And this is a cognitive style termed weak central coherence. Now, this is the reason in this case, the ASD man has hypersensitivities to sensory perceptions. So the inability to hold information in mind in order to use it later in other tasks is what causes the person with ASD to lack central coherence. A lack of cognitive central coherence can easily cause, in this case, the ASD husband, to miss important and subtle cues that create meaning in a social context. So with these three traits that I just listed, central coherence, theory of mind, executive function, I don't really understand what might be in the mind of my NT wife in this case, what she might be thinking, and then what she might be feeling based on her thinking, and then why she behaves the way she does based on her feeling. And I don't understand her opinions, I don't understand her perspective, and sometimes her feelings are utter nonsense to me because I don't have an emotional vocabulary. I'm out of touch with my feelings, and therefore I'm out of touch with her feelings as well. So, long way around the bush to describe this, but in a nutshell, you have the NT wife who is highly social and highly emotional, and then you have the ASD man who is low perhaps in social skills and emotionality, but very high in logic. And so she appeals to him through emotions and from social competencies, while he tries to appeal to her through logic. She's speaking German, he's speaking French, and they don't understand one another. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule. You'll get a follow-up email immediately after purchasing a session that will have the Zoom link that coincides with the day and time that you picked. I will get an email too that you scheduled a session, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk. I look forward to working with you. Hey guys, this is Mark. Click on the join button underneath any of my videos, then click on members only videos, and then click on join. And for $9.99 a month, you'll have access to members only videos, which are excerpts from previous workshops I've conducted for NT partners, ASD partners, and the neurodiverse couple. New videos will be uploaded weekly.